Good afternoon, everybody. This is Massimo Leone, Director of the Center for Religious Studies at the Bruno Kessler Foundation in Trento. Today we have a new a seminar of our series on embodiment and disembodiment in religion and ethics. And in particular, today we have the great pleasure to host a very distinguished speaker, a Professor Havi Carel, who is Professor of Philosophy at the University of Bristol, where she also teaches medical students. Havi has published on the embodied experience of illness, epistemic injustice in healthcare, vulnerability, well-being within illness, transformative experience, death, and on the experience of respiratory illness. She is the author of Illness, published in 2008, then re-edited, republished in 2013, 2018, Life and Death in Freud and Heidegger, 2006, and Phenomenology of Illness in 2016. She is also the co-editor of Health, Illness and Disease, 2012, and What Philosophy Is, 2004. A very prolific author then. She has recently been awarded a £2.6 million Wellcome Discovery Award. So congratulations on that, Professor Carel, for a project on epistemic injustice in healthcare. The acronym of the project, if you want to know more, is EPIC. In 2020, she completed a Wellcome Trust Senior Investigator Award, leading the Life of Breath project. Havi won, among other things, the IJPS 2021 Parisia Prize for a paper, When Institutional Opacity Meets Individual Vulnerability, Institutional Testimonial Injustice, with a Professor Kidd as a co-author, and a text that was published in the International Journal of Philosophical Studies. Given the amount of the number of your engagements and activities, we really thank you very much, Professor Carel, for finding time to meet us. We were really looking forward to meeting you, and we thank also Lucia, Professor Lucia Gavani, for facilitating this meeting. So Professor Havi Carel is going to present a lecture on embodiment, disembodiment in the phenomenology of medicine, and it is with great pleasure that I give you the floor, Professor Carel.
Thank you so much, Massimo, and thank you, Lucia, and hi, everyone. So I can only see 6 people on the screen, but I was instructed by Lucia that it'll be quite a mixed audience. So some people will be philosophers, some people will be phenomenologists, some people will be clinicians of various sorts and bioethicists. So what I thought I would do is really try and give a sort of comprehensive introduction, if you like, to phenomenology of illness. So I apologize in advance to people who already know this stuff, and I apologize in advance to people who might find it all very, very new. But I think what I will do is speak for a little bit, but please do feel free to stop me along the way if you want me to clarify something or repeat something. And again, afterwards in the Q&A, I'm very happy to go more specifically into specific topics. So Lucia mentioned intersubjectivity, and if people want to talk about embodiment and disembodiment in specific thinkers like Husserl or Heidegger and so on, I'm completely open. This is really meant to be something that will be helpful to the audience, obviously. So please do jump in with questions, comments, requests for clarification. And what I will do is, first of all, share my slides. And if that works, then we can get started. Okay, can you see the screen?
Yes, perfectly, thank you.
Oh, perfect, okay. So, what I really want to try and do is explain why I had the very strong conviction that phenomenology is going to be a really useful methodology for understanding the experience of illness in particular. So that you can see this Frida Kahlo painting from 1944, I think, and you can see already something very phenomenologically fundamental in this, that this is about how she experiences her accident. So I think when she was about 18, she was involved in a tram accident and had a spinal injury that caused her enormous amounts of pain, I think, for a long time afterwards. And what we can see in the image is really an attempt to convey the subjective feeling of that injury, depicted in the nails that are piercing the body. And I think this is really where phenomenology has its strongest point. It doesn't replace a naturalistic approach within clinical medicine, but it augments it. So the attempt here isn't to say, the naturalistic approach or any attempt to view the body as an objective, organic or biological entity is erroneous. We should get rid of it and replace it with phenomenology. No, not at all. What I'm actually saying is that it is a very useful way to augment the naturalistic approach, because what phenomenology can give us is precisely something that clinical, naturalistic, objectivistic, clinical medicine cannot. And I express it, I think, the most clearly through this distinction between disease and illness. So disease is on the domain of the naturalistic language and is simply a dysfunction of the biological body. So a body system or an organ don't do what they're supposed to do. The kidneys, the liver, the brain, the lungs, the heart. Now, what illness is the experience of that dysfunction. So the dysfunction, the individual cells in our bodies don't experience anything wrong, right? Our liver doesn't feel itself to be ill, but the illness is experienced on the global level of the lived body as a whole, and a disease is experienced as a disruption of the lived body. So I use the term illness to denote this disruption of the lived body, and the term disease to refer to the unexperienced or non-experiential dysfunction of a biological body. And the basic claim I think phenomenology gives us, which naturalistic approaches can't, is when we change somebody's physical makeup, one's physical orientation, one's physical way of being in the world, what we do is actually change how they are. So the Frida Kahlo post-accident is quite profoundly different to the one before in the sense of freedom, sense of objectification, the kinds of intersubjective encounters that are possible, the sense of possibility, and a host of other ways in which that change comes about. And what was really important for me, excuse me a minute, is to try and capture this first person account. And I think what phenomenology can do is give us the language and the concepts and the tools with which to express what this feels like in the first person, what this change in physical possibility does to our first person subjective experience. So phenomenology, more broadly speaking, is used to describe what phenomenologists from Husserl onwards called the essential structure of experience. So not contingent factors like that my jumper is blue rather than red, but the essential features of experience, what is intrinsic and universally shared across, for example, all experiences of illness. And I put a picture in the image. The image you can see is that of an Austrian postbox, because Husserl apparently in his lectures often asked his students to imagine a postbox and to try and think about what features of it are essential. For example, that it's a three-dimensional object, and which are accidental or contingent. For example, that it is orange in its color. And phenomenology also asks and answers transcendental questions about the conditions of possibility of things to be the way they are. And I think ideally it was aimed at achieving epistemic certainty, even though phenomenological practice has shown us over the years that is not entirely possible. So what is it useful for as a philosophical method? It's useful for illuminating the quality of subjective experiences. And again, if we're thinking specifically about illness experiences, those experiences can be very dramatic, ones in which the body is modified, is changed profoundly. For example, consider somebody who becomes a quadriplegic. One day they can walk and run, the next day they can't move their body from the neck down. The sense of freedom, for example, and agency and autonomy, of course, changes profoundly in illness. And that change in our terms of embodiment and hence of our subjective experiences can be captured by phenomenology. Also, their personal meanings. So I'm thinking here, I love this painting by Bonnard, a painting of his wife who was ill with depression, what we would now call depression, and was assigned something called hydrotherapy, where she lay in the bath for up to 10 hours a day in an attempt to alleviate her suffering. And what I think the painting tries to do is convey the personal meaning of that experience to her, and possibly also to Bonnard as a painter and as her husband. Looking at the way in which her body is framed in a series of boundaries or limits, if you like, the water, then the edge of the bath, then the tiles. Thinking about the angle from which she's painted, from the top down, and the passivity of the body. This is really one way in which we can think about how personal meanings are mined and then shared, for example, through the use of a painting. And then finally, the pattern and coherence, because what we find in illness is, of course, it's not just a momentary or singular experience, but it's something that we experience over time. And of course, experiences of illness can change greatly. I think how somebody might feel about their, for example, cancer diagnosis the day after the diagnosis would be profoundly different to how they might feel 10 years later. So this is particularly, I think, relevant when we think about chronic illness, both somatic and psychiatric or mental. What phenomenology is interested in is, again, this is another way of distinguishing it from naturalistic approaches. It's not interested in a causal story. It's not asking what causes the disease, what are the pathogens, for example, involved in the disease, how do we treat the disease, but in the ideal content, and trying to understand what the disease experience or the illness experience contains within it, and how we can share it, use it to communicate, use it to educate healthcare professionals, and ultimately use it to empower patients. This is just a quick example of how phenomenology works in practice. So Husserl famously wrote a lot about music apprehension. And here is how he tries to explain the difference between hearing a series of discrete notes and hearing a melody. So the tone begins, he writes, and it steadily continues. The now tone, the current note, changes into a tone having been, it moves into the past. The impressional consciousness, constantly flowing, passes over into ever new retentional consciousness. So one thing Husserl could deduce about human consciousness is that it has these structures of retention and protension. It retains the note that's just been, and it anticipates or pretends the note that is about to be played. And he says this ability for retention and protension are the conditions that enable us to hear a melody, again, rather than just individual notes. I'll skip this. So I'm going to skip Heidegger and move on to Merleau-Ponty. And what is interesting about Merleau-Ponty's work, I think maybe most greatly exemplified in his great magnum opus, Phenomenology of Perception, published in 1945, is the real emphasis on the body subject, what he called the body subject. So rather than taking a more Cartesian, if you like, approach, as we find in many accounts of illness, where people say things like, oh, their body is ravaged by disease, but their soul is completely free. And we have these contrasts between the mind and the body, as I just myself talked about, somatic versus mental illness. Merleau-Ponty really wanted us to see us as an integrated, as a unified whole. and not to fall prey to this, to his mind, false distinguishing or prizing apart of the mental from the bodily. So he wants to not just think about how the consciousness operates and perception operates, but actually to think, go beyond consciousness to the body, and as I said, reject the mind-body dualism that was very prominent in the history of philosophy previously. What's important for Merleau-Ponty, and we'll see how this plays itself out in illness in a minute, is that perception is both constitutive and embodied. So without the body, there is no perception. And he's got a very nice phrase. He says, the body is our medium for having a world. We wouldn't be able to have a world if we didn't have a body. And it's also constitutive of that world and the horizon of our perception being set up and enabling us to experience the world. And this is Gallagher and Zahavi writing about Husserl. The body, they say, is considered a constitutive or transcendental principle precisely because it is involved in the very possibility of experience. So Merleau-Ponty tries to articulate in Phenomenology of Perception what he calls the sense structure of experience. And what's very important to him is to try and elucidate pre-reflective lived experience. So this is my dog, Laika. And you can see here exactly what is captured by pre-reflective lived experience. The intentionality of her body, her being completely focused on a stick that's being thrown off the outside the frame of the photo, the way, you know, the ears, the mouth, the eyes, the flexing, the tensing of the muscles is all intending towards this object. But that ability to experience and make sense of the world in real time is really what this pre-reflective lived experience is like, and what Merleau-Ponty wanted to try and understand in his Phenomenology of Perception. How does it come about that we, or a dog for that matter, can move around in the world, be engaged in it, intend towards objects in it, and move within the world in this kind of seamless way, manipulating tools, using objects, interacting and relating to the environment in a variety of ways? How does this all happen? And what was important to him is to say, this is not an empiricist picture. It's not just sense data entering, you know, say the dog's eyes and brain, but this is a meaningful activity, right? The chasing of a stick is very meaningful to a dog. And there's how we interpret the everyday world within this context of pre-reflective lived experience that was at the core of his attention. Now, I want to specifically say something about motor intentionality and about perceptual experience and subjectivity. And if we start thinking now how this could be modified in cases of modified embodiment. So Jessica Cox is a very adventurous spirit. So she learned how to fly an airplane, but she doesn't have arms. So she uses her feet to fly the airplane. And that, of course, means that her motor intentionality, the way in which her body and her body organs and parts intend towards the world is profoundly different to how we would do it, right? So normally we'd use our hands, sorry, you don't drive an airplane like that, but, you know, you'd use our hands to manipulate the levers and the parts of the airplane. But here's an example where that intentionality is modified, and actually by using the feet. But what we can see here is that there is something that Merleau-Ponty calls an intentional arc. Normally, it would be our hands used for manipulating the environment, in this case, manipulating the various buttons and levers that are needed. In her case, it's the use of the feet. But that intentional arc connects us to the world and connects us to the action and the project, if you like, that we are trying to carry out. So what we can see here is that what Merleau-Ponty called the habitual body could be greatly transformed in cases of illness and disability. And again, the body subject stays intact in cases of illness and disability, but interesting things nonetheless happen to it, which moves us on now to consider specifically the phenomenology of illness and what that might be like. So the next few slides have stills from a film I highly, highly recommend called The Diving Bell and the Butterfly, directed by Julian Schnabel and based on a memoir written by Jean-Dominique Bobby, who was the editor of the French Vogue and had a stroke, which completely transformed his life from being, a very active, healthy, successful man to becoming paralyzed in his entire body except for his left eyelid, the blinking of which he used to communicate with the world. So if we are trying now to come and consider, so here's another image of him having not really a phone conversation. He's listening, so he's perceptually and cognitively entirely intact, but he can't speak or move his arms or scream. And this is the still that you see at the bottom. He's having a very, mediated conversation where his girlfriend is leaving him, and he wants to sort of scream and shout and object, but all he can do is use the nurse to mediate his communications back to her. So that's the kind of profound change that takes place in illness and what the phenomenology of illness tries to capture. So the fundamental question for a phenomenological approach to illness is to ask how individuals experience their disorder. And of course, now that we've got the Merleau-Ponty knowledge in place, that disorder is embodied. So it has to do with how our bodies are in the world. It's enacted. It has to do with the kinds of actions that we can or cannot carry out, and is situated. So it has to do with our situation in the world. It's not just that we are ill, but we are also ill within a context of being, for example, rich or poor, lonely or surrounded by family, supported or unsupported, and so on. So the question here is, how are embodied states lived as meaningful in an environment? That is the phenomenological question, if you like. How do particular embodied states that are modified or indeed limited by the illness still lived as meaningful in a particular environment? What I wanted to contrast here in this slide is the difference between Bobby's embodiment, which, as I said, completely paralyzed except for his left eyelid, and contrast that with Pina Bausch dancer performing one of her pieces on the stage. And you can see on the top image the spontaneity, the freedom, the agency, the power, the expressiveness. And you can see in the bottom image how all that can be taken away from somebody when they are ill or severely ill. And what's important here is that we can see the ill person as a being in the world and how that being in the world is modified in the case of illness. So it's not just that your liver isn't working properly, but your goals, the way you act in the world, your attunement and connection to the environment are all modified. In other words, this is a disruption of lived experience in the most global way possible. And again, going back to this idea that physical possibility transforms subjectivity, we can see that how it plays itself out in the case of illness. Okay, so what illness really does is removes the body's transparency. And it gives us also a rare opportunity to perceive the gap, if you like, between the physical body, the physical physiological entity or organism, and the body as we live it. And that mismatch, for example, in the image, somebody could be, be skinny and healthy and fit, but still perceive themselves as heavy, big, fat, needing to lose weight, for example, in the case of anorexia nervosa or body dysmorphia. And there are also profound elements of otherness and alienation and objectification that can take place in the case of illness. In particular, when we start thinking about the clinical encounter and how people, for example, are come to think about their bodies in the context of a hospital appointment, where, for example, they have an X-ray taken or a scan of some sort or some kind of surgery. So this focus on the biological body, which again is the target of clinical naturalistic clinical medicine, can cause a sense of objectification on the phenomenological side of things. So thinking about what the phenomenological side of things, I would say in the most general sense, the experience of illness redefines our relationship to the world. And again, another Frida Kahlo painting here, you can see how the different elements, this is, I think, this was painted after she had a miscarriage. I think she had several miscarriages, but you can see the thread sort of connecting her to, the baby, the medical procedure, to her own anatomy that was, as I said, damaged by the tram accident and so on. So it can help us to see how illness, again, isn't just some localized dysfunction of, say, in this case, her ability to carry a pregnancy to term, but actually something that redefines one's relationship to the world, in the sense of there's physical change, psychological change, social change, and temporal adjustment, all of which take place sometimes in a very intensive, short period of time. There are also a series of losses, as we'll see in a minute, but agency is lost, productive function is lost, the ability to participate in social events, for example, and one's financial status. So illness can be a profound disruption, sometimes something that can really, destroy lives. For example, I'm thinking of countries where healthcare is only afforded to the wealthy, or is private. And we can also think of the experience of illness as a sort of limit case of our bodies. And I'm thinking here again about Jean-Dominique Bauby, and here we go. And really that the complete inability to move any part of his body, and how frustrating that must be. So it could be a limit case that really takes us all the way to the edge of what it means to be alive, when motility is taken away, when agency is taken away. And you can ask yourself what it might be like to live an embodied state like that over a period of time. Okay, so what I want to do now is run us through a series of phenomenological frameworks, thinking about illness as disability, as breakdown, as homelessness, and then finally present a model that gives us the essential features of illness by S.K. Toombs. So first, illness as disability, or being unable to be. This is a model that I developed, and it's based on Heidegger's premise that existence is possibility, that human existence is unique in that it is one that is based on our possible future, our possibilities that are open to us, and our freedom to choose between them, which Heidegger thinks distinguishes us from, for example, rocks and plants and tables and chairs. So human existence is uniquely open because it's made out of these possibilities. And then Merleau-Ponty sort of picked up on this idea, but said, look, yes, the possibility is there, but it's not unbounded, because the possibility, when we cash it out, is an ability to perform actions in the world. And if we can't perform the relevant actions, we can't pursue that particular possibility. So here's somebody enjoying a skydive, and you might say, well, somebody might very much wish to pursue that possibility, but for example, their health won't allow them to do that. So that possibility is in effect closed off for them. And Iris Marion-Young, who's a 20th century phenomenologist who was very interested in Merleau-Ponty's work, developed that idea further to discuss the impact on motility, comportment, and spatiality that might arise from the limitation of possibilities. So recall the first insight we started out with, that a change in physical possibility changes our subjectivity. And here's her example. She wrote a great essay called Throwing Like a Girl, which I warmly recommend. And in it, she says, look, when a girl throws a ball, it often doesn't go as far as when a boy throws a ball. But that's not because of any intrinsic physiological properties of female versus male bodies. But this is rather because of social censorship, if you like, of women's movements. So she says, if you look at the the woman thrower, you can see a couple of things. You can see that it's an isolated movement using the elbow, not really using the entire force of the body and the shoulder to create a powerful throw like the professional baseball player on the left. It uses only the space in front, back and forth, rather than using the sideways space the way he does. And the body isn't as engaged in the throw, if you like, isn't completely as involved in the throw as the professional baseball player's throw. And she says this isn't some physiological or essentialist edict or necessity. It's not something that stems from how women's bodies are, but it stems from how we raise women to not take up a lot of space, for example, to be polite, to not behave aggressively, to restrain and contain their bodily movements, and so on. So for Iris Marion Young, it is this type of subjectivity that arises because of the impact that, in this case, sexism has on our motility, our comportment, and our spatiality. So that's, I think, a really good example of how we change one's subjectivity and impact on the physical possibilities they have, and how, when we limit bodies in particular ways, we get various restrictions to their agency as well. The second one is for illness as breakdown. And I used the image at the top. I thought it was hilarious. I looked up in Google image. I just said car breakdown. And it looks like cars never break down for men, only for women. So I thought I would use this image also to make a brief comment about, sexist algorithms and how we associate, helplessness with respect to technology and machinery when we consider these things. So if you take Heidegger's tool analysis, he talks about how tools break down and become conspicuous when they break down. So he says, if you take a pen, as long as the pen is working, we don't really think about the pen. We think about the words, the letter we're writing, for example. It's when that pen stops working that all of a sudden we turn our attention to it rather than using it as this transparent background for the ideas we're trying to convey, for example. And he thinks that health is similarly, not Heidegger thinks, but I guess Sartre to an extent, and I also think that health is not completely transparent, but usually quite transparent. It's transparent because it just allows us to do what we're trying to do. You're trying to play football, carry your shopping home, run a half marathon, study late into the night, finish your book. All of these things rely on our bodies behaving in particular ways, of being compliant in particular ways, of doing what we need them to do. And in that respect, insofar as our bodies do what we need them to do, we don't really consider them very much. Again, recall Husserl's formulation, Merleau-Ponty's formulation, that my body is my medium for having a world. And as such, it's the kind of, null point from which my experiences radiate outwards, engaging with the things I perceive, with the things I see, with the things I'm interested in. On the other hand, what happens in illness is that the body exactly becomes conspicuous. And we recall the famous passage from Being and Nothingness where Sartre talks about having a headache. And he says, I don't experience the headache as such, but what happens is there I am trying to read a book and my head starts throbbing and my eyes start hurting. And then the more time passes, the more I experience that headache as a disruption to my reading. The headache is sabotaging my ability to read. So the body becomes conspicuous through the disruption of our actions and our activity and our attempts to carry out projects. He could no longer read when the headache got really bad. Now you might say, well, are you saying that the body is a tool? And I would say, no, not really. But I think it's a really useful analogy, this idea of the transparency of tools and them only becoming conspicuous in instances of breakdown. And of course, it's important to remember the breakdown can be local or overarching. So if you sprain your ankle, for example, that could be quite a localized breakdown. So you'd have to sort of hobble on one leg for a couple of days. But the breakdown can also be overarching in the case of serious illness. The third model of illnesses, homelessness, is taken from Friedrich Svenius, the Swedish philosopher of medicine, who talks about the ill body as unhomelike being in the world. And he uses this expression to talk about illness as disorientation, as being lost in the world. Our bodies have changed, but we don't know how to use them to navigate, to make our way in the world through this now disabled or less able body that has become so as a result of an illness. And what the role of medicine is, according to Svenius, is to provide a way home, to help ill people feel at home again, once again in the world. And the interesting idea that I think relates to that is something that I call health within illness, and is a way for us to consider how we experience our illness over time. And of course, in the case of chronic illness, we can have many instances where that health radiates back into periods, for example, where the illness is stable. And yes, of course, we're disabled. We can't do everything as we did before. We might have symptoms. It might be uncomfortable, but the illness recedes to the background. And those periods of stability can be ones in which people experience really quite a lot of well-being and even consider themselves healthy or say that they feel well, as opposed to periods where the illness is exacerbated, the disease progresses, or the symptoms become prominent, in which that wellness within illness is disrupted. The final model I wanted to touch on is by the philosopher S.K. Toombs, the American philosopher of medicine. And what she wants to say is that essential features of illness transcend particular features of different diseases. So she's interested in a universal kind of schema, if you like, one that would unify, renal disease from bulimia, from the flu, and say, what are the universal features that are shared amongst all these different diseases? Obviously, there are profound differences between each medical condition, but what she's interested in is to think about the essential features that they all share, which I will give you in a minute. And to her, finding those essential features is really crucial, because those features are what constitutes the meaning of illness as we live it. And being able to articulate those will enable us a shared world of meaning. And that's particularly important when we think about healthcare professionals and how we want to try and convey to them the meaning and the experience of our illness. So this is Kay, and here are the features. She talks about the essential features of illness, the ones that are shared across all kinds of illness, as being a loss of wholeness, so my body no longer feels whole to me. A loss of certainty, so I'm no longer trusting my body to be able to do particular things with ease and spontaneity as they did before. A loss of control, so again, the body doesn't obey me in the way it used to in the past, so that think again about the transparency of health that is gone. A loss of a freedom to act, so a loss of being able to just spontaneously go out, walk around, go for a jog, go dancing, carry my shopping home, and so on. And finally, the loss of the familiar world, so the way in which the world becomes hostile and estranged in the case of illness. Now, of course, not all cases of illness experience these features. It's enough to just think of, for example, somebody who's in a coma, right? So they've been profoundly unwell. They're not even conscious. But those losses, can't be experienced in the case of somebody in a coma. But I do think she's managed to articulate beautifully the essential features of illness that characterize most cases of illness. Okay, so in closing, I want to try and pick up a few more threads of thought. The first is whether we should pity, if you like, or whether we should deem lives that are marked by illness or disability as being ones that are less good, ones that can't partake in our vision of the good life, ones that are always lamentable or regrettable, if you like. And I really like this is the disability activist Harriet Johnson, and I really like this thought she expressed in an interview she gave quite a long time ago. Are we worse off? She asks. I don't think so. For those of us with congenital conditions, disability shapes all we are. Those disabled later in life adapt. We take constraints that no one would choose and build rich and satisfying lives within them. And I think from the point of view of ethics, which Massimo touched on a bit in the beginning, that's of course a key insight. We take constraints that no one would choose and build rich and satisfying lives within them. How do we then reconcile, if you like, the fact that none of us choose to fall ill, but we can still, live that adversity in rich and satisfying ways? Now I want to say something about the the encounter between the health professionals and the ill person. Something about, again, going back to this idea of objective versus subjective. So the physician, this is something Toom says, the physician construes the illness as a disease state, while the patient encounters both the suffered illness, so how their body feels to them, the suffering, the incapacity, the slowness, the pain, the fatigue, and so on, and the disease itself, the objective facts about their disease. In other words, the ill person encounters the body as painfully lived. So these are just different explanatory models, and I think what's useful is to hang on to both of these concepts, disease and illness, in order to see how the target of clinical medicine is the disease, is again the bodily dysfunction, whilst the target of the patient's narrative would be the illness, the suffering experienced as a result of the disease. So I hope this was useful. I think, yeah, this is the last slide. What I really wanted to do is to try and say something about why phenomenology is useful and why we really need to understand our lived experience. Of course, for our own sake, as individuals who are undergoing really profoundly significant changes to our bodies and our lives, and we want to be able to articulate those, but also for the sake of therapeutic goals. So the better the clinician understands what life is with condition X, the better the therapeutic alliance is between the patient and the healthcare professional. I also think that if we really stick to the biomedical or naturalistic model on its own, we see that it's incomplete for care, and that we do need a phenomenological perspective to augment that. And also we can think of very concrete outcomes or improvements or benefits that can be experienced if we use this phenomenological approach to really give very in-depth and complete comprehensive accounts of what illness is like. It can improve the levels of compliance and trust. It can probably lessen the risk of a misdiagnosis. It can improve. I mean, patient experience in the UK has become a bit of a trope. How can we give you the best patient experience? But actually, the experience of illness has, as I said, these multiple dimensions that are significant and important to understand. And it's also useful for the training and teaching of healthcare staff. So I should say, I didn't put this on this slide, but I actually have a paper from 2012 where I develop a patient toolkit based on phenomenological principles. So if anybody's particularly interested in that, please just drop me an email and I'll send you a PDF of the paper. And the same goes for any of the other papers. So Thank you very much for listening. And as Massimo said, I'm lucky to be funded by the Wellcome, and I'm grateful to them for the funding of my time for research. Thank you very much.